A DNA test was supposed to confirm something simple. Scientists already had the answer prepared. They knew what they were going to find before they even ran the sample. Every textbook, every academic paper, every archaeology department in every university in America agreed on the origin story of Native Americans, and the Cherokee were supposed to fit neatly inside it. But the results came back wrong, not slightly off, not a minor statistical variation. The results came back with genetic markers that had no business being inside a Native American bloodline. Markers linked to ancient Egypt, markers tied to populations from the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coast, and North Africa. Markers connected to ancient Hebrew communities and to the Berbers of the Sahara. Markers that pointed toward civilizations on the other side of an ocean that, according to the official story, nobody had crossed before Columbus in 1492. And when the scientists ran it again, the results held. When independent researchers ran their own tests on different Cherokee descendants across different states, the results held again. The percentage of these unexpected markers was not small enough to explain away as contamination or statistical noise. In some Cherokee bloodlines, the haplogroup T marker, one of the clearest indicators of ancient Egyptian and Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, appeared at a rate of nearly 27%. Egypt itself only shows haplogroup T at around 25% of its population. The Cherokee were matching ancient Egypt more closely than most modern populations in the region between the Nile and the Levant. This is not a fringe claim buried in an obscure corner of the internet. This is the result of structured, peer-examined DNA studies conducted by researchers at DNA consultants, published in academic literature, replicated across multiple testing phases, and confirmed by independent analysis from geneticist Stephen Jett, who concluded that the distribution of these haplogroups was too specific, too internally consistent, and too genetically distinct from post-1492 European admixture patterns to be explained by colonial-era contact. Something older was in that blood. Something that the official story of American history has never been comfortable explaining, and the deeper researchers have looked, the more uncomfortable the explanation becomes. To understand why this finding hit so hard, you have to understand what the official story was built on. For decades, the dominant model of Native American origins rested on a single migration event. A small founding population, the theory said, crossed from Siberia into Alaska via a land bridge that existed during the last ice age, sometime between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. That group fanned out southward and eastward, eventually populating 2 entire continents. Their genetic signature, passed down through mitochondrial DNA from mother to child through every generation, should have been identifiable, traceable, and consistent. Researchers cataloged 4 main maternal haplogroups found across Native American populations, labeled A, B, C, and D. These 4 groups tied Native American ancestry firmly to Eastern Asia and Siberia. Later, a 5th group, labeled X, was added to the list, and it caused immediate discomfort because haplogroup X does not trace to Siberia. It traces to the Near East and to Western Eurasia. It appears in small but measurable frequencies in populations across Europe and the Middle East, and it had no clean explanation in the land bridge model. Scientists added it to the official Native American haplogroup list and moved on, describing it as rare, isolated, and probably explainable through some mechanism not yet fully understood. Then came the Cherokee. When researchers from DNA consultants assembled a study population of Cherokee descendants who had submitted mitochondrial DNA samples and received results that did not match the standard A, B, C, or D haplogroups, the picture that emerged was not just unexpected. It was structurally inconsistent with everything the land bridge model predicted. 85% of the Cherokee test subjects in the study showed anomalous haplogroups, not the occasional outlier, not 1 or 2 unusual cases in a population otherwise dominated by standard markers. The majority. Haplogroup T appeared as the dominant unexpected lineage, followed by U, then X, then J, then H. These are not Siberian lineages. Haplogroup T is found predominantly in ancient Egyptian and northeastern African populations, in the Levant, and among certain ancient Mediterranean peoples. Haplogroup U is one of the oldest maternal lineages in the human family, and appears most frequently across the Middle East and parts of Europe, particularly in communities with roots in the ancient Fertile Crescent. Haplogroup J is a Near Eastern lineage with strong representation in ancient Hebrew and Arab populations. Haplogroup X, the one that had already caused quiet alarm among geneticists, appeared here again, and researcher Stephen Jett, reviewing the Cherokee findings, put in writing what the numbers made unavoidable. The haplogroup distribution in the Cherokee study matched in its overall proportions the populations of Egypt, Israel, and other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. And no combination of post-1492 European immigration into Cherokee communities could have produced that specific mix in those specific ratios. The mathematics of recent admixture did not fit the data. Whatever was in Cherokee blood had been there a long time. The implications of that conclusion are enormous. not dramatic in the entertainment sense, but genuinely, structurally enormous in what they demand of the accepted history of the Americas. If Cherokee women were carrying haplogroups T, U, J, and X in frequencies matching ancient Mediterranean populations before any European ship touched North American soil, then someone from the other side of the Atlantic had reached the Cherokee at some point before Columbus. Not a rumor of contact, not a trade item that passed through 100 hands across a continent over centuries. Actual human beings whose daughters had daughters who had daughters, an unbroken biological chain of mothers and children reaching across time, carrying the genetic evidence of that original meeting in every cell of their bodies. Who were those people? This is where the research branches into territory that mainstream archaeology and genetics have been reluctant to enter, not because the evidence is weak, but because the institutional consequences of accepting the evidence are severe. The land bridge model is not just a scientific theory. It is a cornerstone of the entire academic structure built around the story of the Americas. Archaeological dating systems, interpretations of cultural development timelines, legal and political frameworks around Native American land rights and tribal identity, and the foundational narrative of American history as a story of European discovery and settlement all depend to varying degrees on the Americas, having been genuinely isolated from the Old World until the late 15th century. To acknowledge ancient transatlantic contact is to begin pulling a thread that unravels a great deal of what sits on top of it, but several researchers have not flinched from following the evidence. Donald Yates, a genealogist and DNA researcher who has spent years studying Cherokee genetic history, has argued in published work, including the book Old World Roots of the Cherokee, that the DNA evidence, combined with linguistic and cultural analysis, points toward ancient Phoenician and Jewish contacts with North America, possibly as far back as the 3rd century BCE. The Phoenicians were the greatest maritime civilization the ancient Mediterranean produced. They sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is the modern Strait of Gibraltar, into the open Atlantic. Phoenician trade routes reached Britain, the Canary Islands, and possibly the Azores. The question of whether Phoenician ships pushed further west, driven by storm or by deliberate exploration, and whether some of those sailors eventually reached the eastern coast of North America, is not scientifically absurd. The genetics do not prove it, but the genetics are consistent with it in a way that demands a serious answer rather than institutional silence. The Cherokee themselves, long before any DNA study was ever run, preserved oral traditions and cultural practices that researchers have struggled to fit inside a purely Siberian origin framework. The priestly class of the Cherokee, known as the Ani-Kotani, operated a system of spiritual authority and hereditary religious knowledge that bore structural similarities to ancient priestly castes in Near Eastern civilizations. The Seven Clan organization of Cherokee society, the use of purification rituals, the practice of separating military activities from spiritual activities as two distinct domains with different moral rules, and the ceremonial calendars built around specific astronomical cycles all have parallels in ancient cultures of the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean that are difficult to attribute simply to coincidence or independent parallel development. When John Howard Payne visited the Cherokee in the 1830s and recorded what the elders told him about their own history and traditions, the picture that emerged was of a people with an elaborate, highly structured ancient order that had already gone through a major historical rupture, a revolt against the priestly class that had ended hereditary religious authority and replaced it with individual spiritual knowledge. That is a specific kind of internal historical narrative. It describes a real event, a specific political and religious crisis, rather than a general mythological origin story. Something happened to the Ani-Kotani, something real enough that the memory of it restructured Cherokee spiritual authority for generations afterward. What exactly happened, and who the Ani-Kotani really were in terms of their origin and their connection to whatever old world contacts the DNA records, remains an open question that Cherokee oral history has preserved without resolving. Then there's the linguistic puzzle that nobody has satisfactorily answered. The Cherokee speak an Iroquoian language, and this has always been one of the central curiosities of their position in the southeast. All other Iroquoian-speaking peoples are found further north, in the Great Lakes region and around what is now New York and Ontario. The Cherokee are the Iroquoian linguistic outlier, stranded in the southern Appalachians, surrounded by speakers of completely unrelated language families. Two explanations have competed for over a century. One says the Cherokee migrated south from the Great Lakes region in ancient times, bringing their Iroquoian language with them. The other says the Cherokee were always in the southeast, and that the Iroquoian language itself may have developed there, spreading north rather than south. Neither explanation fully satisfies the archaeological and genetic evidence. And Donald Yates has proposed a third possibility, that the Cherokee, prior to contact with Iroquoian-speaking groups in the Ohio Valley, may have spoken an entirely different language altogether, one with possible roots in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean. This is a fringe position by academic standards, but it is not a position arrived at without evidence. The similarities between certain Cherokee ceremonial words and terms found in ancient Near Eastern languages have been noted by multiple researchers. And while linguistic borrowing across ancient contact events is genuinely difficult to prove, the coincidence of DNA markers, cultural parallels, and specific linguistic oddities all pointing in the same geographic direction is harder to dismiss than any single line of evidence would be on its own. The first confirmed European contact with the Cherokee came in 1540, when the Spanish expedition led by Hernando de Soto moved through the mountains of what is now Tennessee. The Spanish recorded encountering communities they called Shellak near the rivers of what would become the border region of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. That contact was devastating. Disease moved faster than the soldiers. Epidemics swept through Cherokee towns before any lasting political or economic relationship was established. Entire communities were destroyed by smallpox and other infections, against which the Cherokee had no immunity. The scale of population collapse across the southeast in the century following initial European contact was so severe that by the time sustained English and French contact began in the late 1600s, the Cherokee the colonists encountered were already a diminished population, living in a landscape that had been partially emptied by disease. A second Spanish expedition under Juan Pardo arrived in 1567 and attempted to establish forts in the interior southeast, including one at a major Mississippian chiefdom called Joara. The indigenous peoples of the region, unwilling to accept Spanish authority over their territory, destroyed nearly every soldier left to garrison those forts. Only one survivor made it back. Spain never again attempted to settle the Cherokee homeland. The mountains had held, but the invisible damage of disease had already been done, and the Cherokee who survived the epidemic waves of the 16th century were the foundation of the nation that later generations would know. The story of what happened to the Cherokee in the 19th century is one of the most thoroughly documented acts of state violence in American history, and it is documented in part because the Cherokee themselves kept records. They had their own written language. In the 1820s, a Cherokee man named Sequoyah, working alone and without formal education in any writing system, developed a complete syllabary for the Cherokee language, a set of characters representing every syllable sound in the language rather than individual letters or whole words. Within a few years of its introduction, literacy spread rapidly through Cherokee communities. They printed newspapers. They drafted legal documents. They wrote letters to the United States government, making detailed and coherent arguments for their sovereignty. None of it was enough. When gold was discovered near Dahlonega, Georgia, in 1828, the pressure on Cherokee lands became irresistible to a federal government willing to look away from its own courts. The Supreme Court, in Worcester v. Georgia, ruled in 1832 that the Cherokee Nation held sovereign status and was entitled to federal protection from state interference. President Andrew Jackson effectively refused to enforce the ruling. In 1838, United States Army troops under General Winfield Scott rounded up Cherokee men, women, and children at gunpoint and marched them westward into what is now Oklahoma. Around 4,000 people, roughly 1/4 of the entire Cherokee Nation, died during the removal and its immediate aftermath. The Cherokee name for this journey translates in English as the trail where they cried. The phrase has passed into history simply as the Trail of Tears, but the original language carries something the shortened name does not: the specific quality of grief, the particular sound of people weeping as they walk away from the land that contains their entire history, including whatever ancient mysteries that land had witnessed and kept. The Cherokee rebuilt. After the Civil War, after the allotment acts that carved up their collective land into individual plots, after decades in which the federal government essentially functioned as though the Cherokee Nation had ceased to exist as a governing body, the people kept coming back. By 1976, they had a new constitution, voted in by the people. In 1985, Wilma Mankiller was elected principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, the first woman to hold that office in the modern era. Her election was not only a historic milestone for Native American governance, it was a return, in a formal political sense, to something older than the 19th century, a recognition that the role of women in Cherokee life had never been merely ceremonial. In traditional Cherokee society, women owned the households and the fields. They headed the clans. They passed identity and lineage to the next generation. The clan system itself, the fundamental organizing principle of Cherokee social life, ran through the female line. A child belonged to the clan of their mother, not their father. This matrilineal structure is consistent across many ancient cultures with roots in the Near Eastern and Mediterranean world, a detail that researchers studying the anomalous DNA findings have noted alongside the genetic and linguistic evidence. It does not prove contact, but it adds another data point to a pattern that keeps pointing in the same direction, regardless of which angle you approach it from. The Cherokee today number in the hundreds of thousands. The Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma is the largest tribal nation in the United States by enrollment. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians maintains its presence in the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina, on land their ancestors held even through the removal era. land that a white adopted son of a Cherokee chief purchased and held for them during the years when the Cherokee themselves were legally forbidden to own property. The language that Sequoyah gave them is being actively taught in Cherokee schools and passed down by elders to children who will carry it into the next century. The ceremonies, the stories, and the clan structures that survived the Trail of Tears, the allotment era, the boarding school period, and every other assault on Cherokee identity are still alive. And underneath all of it, in the cells of every Cherokee descendant who has ever submitted a DNA sample to a testing company, the genetic record is still carrying its secrets forward. Haplogroup T at nearly 27%. Haplogroup U as the single most common anomalous marker, appearing in its oldest and most ancient form. Haplogroup J pointing toward the ancient Levant. Haplogroup X connecting the Cherokee to populations in western Eurasia in a way that neither the land bridge model nor simple colonial era admixture fully explains. Whatever ancient context left those markers in Cherokee blood happened before Columbus, before the Pilgrims, before any European nation had mapped the coastline of North America. Somebody came, somebody stayed long enough to have children. Those children had children. And for generations too numerous to count, that genetic evidence moved through the matrilineal clan system of the Cherokee, from mother to daughter to granddaughter, carrying its record forward through the Trail of Tears, through the rebuilding, through every generation up to the present day. The DNA is not a finished answer. It is a question that American history has not yet found the courage to ask out loud. But the question is in the blood, and the blood does not lie. What do you think got here first? Drop your answer in the comments below.